Jake Martinez pushed his cleaning cart down the empty hallway of the Naval Special Warfare Training Center. The wheels squeaked softly against the polished floor as he made his way through the building that housed some of the toughest warriors in the world. It was past midnight and the SEALs had finished their training hours ago. This was Jake's time when he could work in peace without anyone bothering him. He had been doing this job for 3 years now. Every night he came in at 11 and worked until 7 in the morning. He cleaned the gyms, the classrooms, the equipment rooms, and the offices where the instructors planned their next day of training. Jake knew every corner of this place better than most of the people who worked here during the day. The janitor was a quiet man of 45 with dark hair that was starting to show gray at the edges. He always wore long-sleeved shirts or hoodies, even when the California heat made everyone else wear shorts and tank tops. Around his neck he kept a high collar that covered something he never let anyone see. Jake had learned long ago that staying invisible was the safest way to live. As he entered the main gymnasium, Jake could smell the sweat and effort that lingered in the air. The SEALs had been working hard today. He could tell by the way the equipment was scattered and the amount of towels left behind. These men pushed themselves beyond what normal people thought was possible, and Jake respected that about them. He began his routine, wiping down the exercise machines and collecting the dirty towels. As he worked, he listened to the sounds of the building settling around him. Most people would find the empty building creepy, but Jake found it peaceful. He had grown used to being alone and he preferred it that way. Jake moved with a precision that most people would not notice. His steps were measured and quiet. When he bent to pick something up, he did it in a way that kept his balance perfect. When he reached for items on high shelves, his movements were smooth and controlled. These were not the movements of a simple cleaning man, but nobody was around to see them. In the weapons training room, Jake paused as he always did. The walls were covered with different types of guns, knives, and other tools that the SEALs used in their missions. He knew what each one was for and how to use them, though he had never told anyone this. Sometimes he would look at a particular weapon and remember things he tried not to think about. As he cleaned the room, Jake noticed that someone had left papers on one of the desks. The papers showed plans for a training exercise that was supposed to happen next week. He glanced at the plans while he dusted around them. The exercise was meant to test how well a team could work together to rescue hostages from a building. Jake shook his head slightly as he read the plans. The approach they were planning would not work well. The team would be exposed for too long as they moved through the building. There were better ways to do it, ways that would keep more people alive. But Jake said nothing. It was not his place to give advice to Navy SEALs. He finished cleaning the room and moved on to the next area. In the hallway, he passed photos of SEAL teams from different years. Some of the faces in the older photos belonged to men who had died in combat. Jake stopped in front of one particular photo from 10 years ago. He studied the faces of the young men who had thought they were ready for anything the world could throw at them. Jake understood something about war that these brave men were still learning. He knew that sometimes being the strongest or the fastest was not enough. Sometimes the most important thing was being smart enough to see danger before it found you. Sometimes the most important thing was knowing when to hide. Commander Lisa Hayes arrived at the building early the next morning, just as Jake was finishing his shift. She was one of the few people who came in before 7, and she had seen Jake many times over the past few months. There was something about the janitor that caught her attention, though she could not put her finger on what it was. Lisa was a sharp woman who had worked her way up through the ranks by noticing things that others missed. She had been in combat herself and knew how to read people. When she watched Jake work, she saw someone who moved like he had military training, even though his personnel file said he had never served. This morning, as Jake was emptying trash cans near the main office, Lisa noticed him pause when he heard her talking on the phone about a failed training mission. The mission had gone wrong because the team had made tactical errors that cost them the objective. Lisa was frustrated because she knew the mistakes could have been avoided. Jake continued his work, but Lisa could see that he was listening. When she mentioned the specific mistake that had caused the failure, she saw Jake's jaw tighten slightly. She watched as he shook his head just barely, as if he disagreed with something he had heard. After Lisa finished her phone call, she watched Jake more carefully. The way he moved around the office was different from how other cleaning people worked. He was too aware of his surroundings, too careful about where he stepped and what he touched. His eyes were always checking exits and corners. like someone who had been trained to watch for threats. When Jake bent to pick up a piece of paper that had fallen near Lisa's desk, she caught a glimpse of something unusual. For just a moment, his collar shifted and she saw a part of what looked like a tattoo on his neck. It was not like any tattoo she had ever seen before. The lines were too precise, too geometric, almost like they were some kind of technical drawing. Jake noticed her looking and quickly adjusted his collar to cover the marks. He finished his work and moved on to the next room without making eye contact. Lisa made a mental note to pay more attention to Jake Martinez in the future. Later that day, as the SEALs began their training, Lisa found herself thinking about the janitor. There were too many small things that did not add up. The way he moved, the way he listened, the way he seemed to understand things he should not know about. Lisa had learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts told her that Jake Martinez was hiding something important. Jake finished his shift and walked to his old pickup truck in the parking lot. As he drove home to his small apartment, he thought about the woman who had been watching him. Commander Hayes was smart and observant. He would need to be more careful around her. Jake had worked too hard to build his quiet life to let it fall apart now. At his apartment, Jake pulled off his shirt and looked in the bathroom mirror. The tattoos on his neck extended down across his chest and back, covering him in patterns that would seem impossible to anyone from Earth. The geometric design seemed to shift slightly in the light, as if they were alive. Jake touched one of the patterns and felt a familiar tingling sensation that he had been ignoring for years. He had come to Earth to hide, and hiding meant being invisible. But as Jake looked at his reflection, he wondered how much longer he could keep pretending to be something he was not. The marks on his skin were more than just tattoos, and sooner or later someone was going to figure that out. The object fell from the sky at 3 a.m, creating a streak of blue light that fishermen 200 miles off the California coast would later describe as the most beautiful thing they had ever seen. It hit the Pacific Ocean with enough force to create waves that rocked boats in 3 different harbors. But it did not explode like a meteor should have. Captain Rick Barnes was commanding the USS Denver when his sonar picked up something unusual on the ocean floor. The reading showed an object about the size of a school bus sitting in water that was nearly a mile deep. What made it strange was that the object was giving off a steady signal, like it was trying to communicate with something. Within 6 hours, the Navy had a recovery team in the water. The divers who brought the object to the surface would later say they had never seen anything like it. The thing looked like it had been grown instead of built. Its surface was smooth and dark, with patterns that seemed to shift when nobody was looking directly at them. Dr. Alan Cooper got the call at his office at UC San Diego. He was one of the few people in the world who specialized in unknown languages, and the Navy needed someone who could make sense of the symbols covering the recovered object. Alan had spent his career studying ancient writing systems, but he had never been asked to look at something that might not be from Earth. When Alan first saw the object in the secure facility where the Navy had taken it, he felt his stomach drop. The thing was clearly not made by human hands. It was too perfect, too strange, and too obviously designed by intelligence that thought in ways humans did not understand. The symbols covering its surface were unlike anything in any database of human writing. Jake Martinez was working his normal shift at the SEAL Training Center when news of the discovery reached the base. He was mopping the floor in the main corridor when he overheard 2 instructors talking about the mysterious object that had been pulled from the ocean. As soon as Jake heard the description of the symbols, he felt a cold fear settle in his chest. The fear got worse when Jake learned that Dr. Cooper had been brought in to study the object. Jake knew Dr. Cooper by reputation. The man was smart and determined, exactly the kind of person who would not stop digging until he found answers. Jake finished his work that night, but he could not stop thinking about what might happen if the wrong people started asking the right questions. Dr. Cooper spent 3 days studying the symbols without making any progress. The patterns were too complex and too different from anything human. He had tried comparing them to every known writing system, but nothing matched. The symbols seemed to follow rules that made sense, but Cooper could not figure out what those rules were. On the 4th day, Cooper was working late in his temporary office at the naval base when he decided to take a break and get some coffee. As he walked down the hallway, he saw the night janitor reaching up to clean a light fixture. The man's movements were smooth and precise, like someone who had done physical training for years. When the janitor reached up, his shirt pulled tight and his collar shifted slightly. For just a moment, Cooper saw something that made him stop walking. There were marks on the man's neck that looked exactly like the symbols he had been studying for days. The patterns were identical to what he had seen on the object from the ocean. Cooper felt his heart start beating faster. He watched as the janitor finished his work and moved down the hallway, but Cooper's mind was racing. There was no way it could be a coincidence. The symbols were too specific, too unusual. Someone who had those marks on his skin had to know something about the object. The next morning, Cooper went to the base personnel office and asked about the night janitor. He learned that the man's name was Jake Martinez, and that he had been working at the facility for 3 years. His background check showed nothing unusual. He had no military service, no criminal record, and no special education. According to his file, Jake Martinez was exactly what he appeared to be, a simple man who cleaned buildings for a living. But Cooper could not forget what he had seen. He started staying late at the office, hoping to see the janitor again. He wanted to get a better look at those marks, and he wanted to ask some questions. Cooper had learned over the years that the most important discoveries often came from noticing things that other people overlooked. It took 3 more days before Cooper saw Jake again. This time, Cooper was ready with a camera. When Jake reached up to change a light bulb, Cooper took several quick photos. When he looked at the pictures later, he was certain he had been right. The symbols on Jake's neck were identical to the ones on the alien object. Cooper knew he had to be careful about how he approached Jake. If the man really did know something about the object, Cooper did not want to scare him away, so Cooper waited until Jake was working alone in one of the smaller offices before he made his move. Jake was emptying trash cans when Cooper walked into the room and closed the door behind him. Jake looked up, surprised to see someone in the building so late at night. Cooper could see that Jake was immediately on guard, like someone who was used to being careful around strangers. Cooper introduced himself and explained that he was working on the project involving the object from the ocean. He watched Jake's face carefully as he spoke, looking for any sign of recognition. Jake's expression did not change, but Cooper noticed that the man's hands had stopped moving, and his breathing had become more controlled. Then Cooper pulled out his phone and showed Jake one of the photos he had taken. It was a clear image of the symbols from the alien object. Cooper watched as Jake stared at the photo, and he saw something flicker in the man's eyes. It was fear, mixed with something that might have been recognition. Jake looked up from the phone and asked Cooper what he wanted. His voice was steady, but Cooper could hear tension underneath the calm tone. Cooper explained that he was trying to understand the symbols, and that he thought Jake might be able to help. He did not mention the photographs of Jake's neck, but he could see that Jake knew why Cooper was really there. For a long moment, the 2 men stared at each other in silence. Cooper could see that Jake was thinking hard about something, weighing options in his mind. Finally, Jake asked Cooper if he was the only person who knew about the connection between Jake and the object. Cooper said yes, which was true for now, but he also told Jake that he would not be able to keep the secret forever. Too many people were working on the project, and sooner or later, someone else would notice the same things Cooper had noticed. Cooper said he would rather work with Jake than have to turn him over to military intelligence. Jake was quiet for another long moment. Then he asked Cooper what would happen to him if he helped with the project. Cooper admitted that he did not know. The object was clearly not from Earth, and anyone who had information about it would become very important to a lot of powerful people. Jake nodded slowly, like this was the answer he had expected. He told Cooper that he needed time to think about what to do. Cooper agreed to wait, but he made it clear that he could not wait forever. Too many people were depending on him to find answers about the object. As Cooper left the room, he could see that Jake was struggling with a difficult decision. Whatever the janitor knew about the object, it was something that he had been trying to keep secret for a long time. Cooper felt bad about putting pressure on the man, but he also knew that the stakes were too high to worry about one person's feelings. Jake finished his shift that night, but his mind was not on his work. He had always known this day might come. He had hoped he could stay hidden forever, but deep down he had always known that eventually someone would make the connection. The question now was what he should do about it. As Jake drove home, he thought about Dr. Cooper. The man seemed honest and intelligent, not like someone who would use information to hurt people. But Jake also knew that Cooper was not the one who would make decisions about what happened next. Once the secret was out, Jake would have to deal with people who were much more dangerous than a university professor. At his apartment, Jake stood in front of his bathroom mirror and looked at the marks covering his skin. For 20 years, he had kept them hidden under clothing and high collars. For 20 years, he had pretended to be something he was not. But now someone had seen the truth, and Jake knew that his quiet life was about to end. The marks on his skin were not just tattoos. They were a living technology that connected him to machines and databases that were light years away from Earth. They were proof of who he really was and where he had come from. And now that Dr. Cooper had seen them, Jake would have to decide whether to run or to trust a human with the most dangerous secret in the galaxy. Jake did not sleep that night. He sat in his small kitchen drinking coffee and staring out the window at the city lights. For 20 years he had lived among humans, watching them, learning from them, and slowly forgetting what it felt like to be something else. Now all of that was about to change. Dr. Cooper spent the morning making phone calls. He contacted Commander Hayes and several other officers, explaining that he had made a breakthrough in understanding the symbols. He was careful not to mention Jake by name, but he said he had found someone who might be able to help translate the alien writing. By noon, the conference room at the naval base was filled with people who wanted answers. Commander Hayes was there, along with Captain Barnes, who had recovered the object from the ocean. There were also intelligence officers and scientists from different government agencies. Everyone wanted to know what Cooper had discovered. Cooper explained that he had identified patterns in the alien symbols that matched markings he had found elsewhere. He said he had located a person who might be able to provide more information, but he warned everyone that the situation was complicated. The person in question might not be willing to cooperate, and there might be security issues to consider. Commander Hayes asked the obvious question about where Cooper had found these matching symbols. Cooper hesitated before answering. He said the symbols appeared to be tattoos on a person who worked at the base. This caused an immediate stir in the room as everyone realized they were talking about someone who had been walking among them without anyone knowing his true significance. While the meeting was taking place, Jake was making his own preparations. He went to a storage unit across town where he kept items he hoped he would never need again. Hidden behind boxes of old furniture was a metal case that had not been opened in 15 years. Inside the case were objects that would prove his story, if he decided to tell it. Jake picked up a small device that looked like a piece of black glass. When he touched it, the device came to life with a soft blue glow. Information flowed across its surface in symbols that matched the ones tattooed on his skin. The device was a memory core that contained the history of his people and the reason why he had come to Earth. That afternoon, Cooper received a call from Jake asking to meet in private before any official interrogation began. They agreed to meet in the same office where they had talked the night before. Cooper arrived first and waited nervously, not sure what to expect from a conversation that might change everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the universe. Jake arrived carrying a briefcase that looked old and worn. He seemed calmer than he had the night before, like someone who had made a difficult decision and was ready to live with the consequences. Jake sat down across from Cooper and asked if the professor was ready to hear a story that would sound impossible. Cooper said he was ready for anything. Jake nodded and began to speak in a voice that was steady but filled with old sadness. He said his real name was not Jake Martinez. His real name was Kai Thanos, and he was not from Earth. He belonged to a race called the Altarians, and he had come to this planet as a scout for his people who were fleeing a war that had destroyed half their galaxy. Jake opened his briefcase and pulled out the memory device. When he activated it, the air above the device filled with images that moved like a three-dimensional movie. Cooper watched in amazement as Jake showed him pictures of worlds that existed beyond anything humans had imagined. There were cities that floated in space and ships that could travel between stars in days instead of years. Jake explained that his people had been warriors and explorers for thousands of years. They had been part of a galactic alliance that kept peace among dozens of different species. But then something had gone wrong. A race called the Devourers had appeared from outside their galaxy, bringing with them a hunger that could not be satisfied. The Devourers were not like other species. They did not want territory or resources in the way that most beings understood those things. Instead, they consumed entire civilizations, taking not just the people and the planets but somehow absorbing the knowledge and the culture as well. Worlds that fell to the devourers became empty, dead places where nothing would ever grow again. Jake showed Cooper images of the war that had followed. Entire star systems had been destroyed as the Alliance tried to stop the devourers from spreading. Jake's people, the Altarians, had been among the best fighters in the galaxy, but even they could not stand against an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with every victory. As the war turned against them, the Altarian leadership had made a desperate decision. They would scatter their people across the galaxy, sending small groups to find safe worlds where they could hide until the devourers had moved on to other targets. Jake had been part of a scouting mission sent to identify planets that might serve as refugee camps. Earth had been chosen because it was far from the main war zones and because its people were not yet advanced enough to be detected by devourer sensors. Jake's mission had been to study human society and determine whether his people could hide among the population without being discovered. The plan had been for Jake to spend a few years on Earth and then return with his findings. But Jake's ship had been damaged during the journey to Earth. He had managed to land without being detected, but the damage to his vessel had been too severe to repair with Earth technology. Jake had been stranded, cut off from his people with no way to contact them or return home. Jake had faced a choice. He could reveal himself to Earth's governments and ask for help, but that would risk exposing the planet to attention from the war that was raging across the galaxy. Or he could disappear into human society and wait, hoping that someday his people would find him, or that he would find a way to repair his ship. Cooper listened to all of this with growing amazement and fear. He asked Jake what had happened to the Altarians and whether the Devourers had been defeated. Jake's expression grew darker as he explained that he did not know. He had been cut off from all communication with his people for 20 years. For all he knew, his entire civilization might have been destroyed. Jake pulled up his sleeve and showed Cooper more of the tattoos that covered his skin. He explained that the markings were not just decorations. They were a form of living technology that connected Altarian warriors to their weapons and their ships. The tattoos contained information about military tactics, star maps, and technical knowledge that would take human scientists centuries to understand. Cooper asked why Jake had chosen to work as a janitor instead of trying to help humanity advance technologically. Jake explained that he had studied human history and learned about what happened when advanced technology was introduced too quickly to societies that were not ready for it. Jake had seen civilizations destroy themselves with weapons they did not understand, and he did not want that to happen to Earth. Instead, Jake had chosen to live quietly and observe. He had been impressed by human resilience and creativity, but he had also seen how quickly humans could turn those same qualities toward destruction. Jake had decided that Earth's people needed to develop their own technology at their own pace, without interference from outside forces. Cooper asked the question that had been bothering him since Jake began his story. If Jake had been hiding for 20 years, why was he revealing himself now? Jake's answer sent a chill through Cooper's body. Jake said the object that had been recovered from the ocean was not just any alien probe. Based on the symbols Cooper had shown him, it was a Devourer scout. Jake explained that the Devourers always sent advanced scouts to study potential targets before launching their main attacks. The scouts would map the planet's defenses and identify the most efficient ways to consume the local population. If a Devourer scout had reached Earth, it meant that Jake's people had failed to stop the enemy, and the war had spread to this part of the galaxy. Cooper felt the room seem to spin around him as he realized what Jake was saying. Earth was not just dealing with first contact with alien life. Earth was about to become a target in a galactic war that humanity did not even know existed. Cooper asked how much time they had before the main Devourer force arrived. Jake said he would need to study the scout probe more carefully to determine its exact mission and how long it had been operating near Earth. But based on what he knew about Devourer tactics, the main force would likely arrive within months rather than years. Earth's people needed to prepare for a war unlike anything they had ever imagined. Cooper asked what could be done to defend the planet against such an advanced enemy. Jake was quiet for a long moment before answering. He said that conventional military strategies would not work against the Devourers, but he had spent 20 years studying humans, and he believed that Earth's people might have advantages that other civilizations had lacked. Jake explained that most species in the galaxy followed predictable patterns of behavior that made them vulnerable to devourer tactics. But humans were different. They were unpredictable, stubborn, and refused to accept defeat even when logic said they should surrender. These qualities had made humans difficult for Jake to understand, but they might also make humans impossible for the devourers to defeat. Cooper realized that everything had changed. He was no longer just a professor studying, and Commander Hayes stared at Jake across the conference table, trying to process what she had just heard. The room was filled with military officers and government officials who had been called in for an emergency briefing. None of them had expected to hear that the janitor they had barely noticed was actually an alien warrior with news of an approaching invasion. Jake had removed his shirt to show the full extent of the tattoos covering his body. The geometric patterns seemed to move and shift under the fluorescent lights, creating designs that hurt to look at directly. Dr. Cooper sat beside Jake, still amazed by everything he had learned over the past few days. Admiral Frank Morrison, who had flown in from Washington, was the first to break the silence. He asked Jake to prove that his story was true by demonstrating some of the alien technology he claimed to possess. Jake nodded and touched one of the larger tattoos on his chest. The markings began to glow brighter, and suddenly the air above the conference table filled with a three-dimensional map of the solar system. The map showed Earth at the center, surrounded by the orbits of the other planets. But there were also objects in the display that did not belong in any human understanding of the solar system. Dozens of small red dots were scattered throughout the outer system, moving in patterns that clearly showed they were not natural objects. Jake explained that the red dots represented devourer scout probes that had been operating in Earth's solar system for at least 6 months. The probe that had crashed in the Pacific was only one of many that had been studying Earth's defenses and population centers. Jake manipulated the display to show the movement patterns of the probes, and it became clear that they had been conducting a systematic survey of the entire planet. Captain Barnes asked why Earth's satellites and tracking systems had not detected the probes. Jake explained that devourer technology was designed to avoid detection by primitive sensor systems. The probes could make themselves invisible to radar and could mask their heat signatures to avoid infrared detection. Only someone with Altarian biotechnology would be able to see them. The Admiral asked the most important question: when would the main devourer force arrive? Jake studied the probe movement patterns for several minutes before answering. Based on what he could see, the scouts had been preparing for a major operation. The main invasion fleet would likely arrive within 4 to 6 months. Commander Hayes asked what kind of force Earth would be facing. Jake's expression grew grim as he explained the scale of the threat. A typical devourer invasion fleet contained hundreds of bioships, each one capable of destroying entire cities. The ships were not built like human vessels. Instead, they were grown from living tissue that could repair itself and adapt to different types of attacks. Jake showed them images from his memory device of previous devourer invasions. The officials watched in horror as entire planets were consumed by creatures that looked more like giant insects than spaceships. The devourers did not just destroy their targets. They absorbed them, taking the knowledge and resources of entire civilizations and adding them to their own collective consciousness. Dr. Cooper asked if there was any way to communicate with the devourers, to negotiate or find some peaceful solution. Jake shook his head sadly. He explained that his people had tried diplomacy early in the war. The devourers had listened to offers of peace and cooperation, but they had rejected everything. They were not interested in coexistence. They wanted only to consume and grow stronger. Admiral Morrison asked about Earth's chances of successfully defending against such an attack. Jake was quiet for a long moment before answering. He said that every other civilization the devourers had attacked had fallen within days or weeks. Most had surrendered once they calculated the odds of victory. Those that had fought had used conventional military tactics that the devourers had learned to counter over thousands of years. But Jake also said that he had been studying humans for 20 years, and he believed Earth's people might have advantages that other species had lacked. Humans had a quality that Jake's people called impossible stubbornness. They refused to accept defeat even when logic said they should surrender. This trait had made humans difficult for Jake to understand, but it might also make them impossible for the Devourers to predict. Commander Hayes asked what Earth could do to prepare for the invasion. Jake explained that conventional weapons would not be effective against Devourer bioships. Human military technology was thousands of years behind what would be needed to fight such an advanced enemy, but Jake had knowledge and technology that could help level the playing field. Jake touched another tattoo on his arm, and the room filled with displays showing weapon designs and defensive systems that were far beyond anything humans had ever imagined. He explained that his bio-tattoos contained the complete technical database of the Altarian military. With the right resources and enough time, Earth could build weapons that would give the Devourers a real fight. Captain Barnes asked how long it would take to build such weapons. Jake studied the technical specifications floating in the air around them. He said that with Earth's current industrial capacity, it would take years to build the advanced systems they would need. But Jake also said there might be shortcuts. His biotechnology could interface with human computer systems, allowing for rapid design and testing of new weapons. The Admiral asked about Jake's own combat capabilities. Jake hesitated before answering this question. He explained that he had been a member of the Altarian Vanguard, an elite unit of warriors who specialized in fighting against impossible odds. The bio-tattoos covering his body were not just information storage systems. They were also enhancement technologies that could increase his strength, speed, and reaction time far beyond human levels. To demonstrate, Jake asked everyone to step back from the conference table. He then moved faster than anyone in the room could follow, appearing on the other side of the room almost instantly. When he moved back to his original position, he left behind a detailed technical drawing that he had sketched in the few seconds he had been moving. The drawing showed plans for a weapon system that could be built using Earth technology. Commander Hayes realized that they were not just dealing with an alien invasion. They were also dealing with the fact that one of the most powerful warriors in the galaxy had been living among them, disguised as a janitor. She asked Jake why he had never revealed himself before, even when he might have been able to help humanity advance more quickly. Jake explained that he had watched many civilizations destroy themselves when they gained access to technology they were not ready to handle. He had seen peaceful species turn into galactic conquerors when they developed weapons beyond their wisdom. Jake had believed that humanity needed to develop slowly and naturally, learning the responsibility that came with power. But now the situation had changed. The Devourers were coming whether humanity was ready or not. Jake could no longer protect Earth by keeping his knowledge secret. The only way to save the planet was to share everything he knew and hope that humans could learn to use advanced technology without destroying themselves. Dr. Cooper asked if there were other Altarians who might be able to help defend Earth. Jake said that he had been cut off from his people for 20 years and did not know how many had survived the war, but he explained that Altarian warriors had been scattered across the galaxy as refugees. If any had survived, they would be drawn to any planet that was actively fighting the Devourers. Admiral Morrison made the decision that would change everything. He authorized the immediate creation of a special task force that would work with Jake to prepare Earth's defenses. The project would have unlimited funding and access to the best scientists and engineers in the world. Everything would be classified at the highest levels, but the work would begin immediately. As the meeting broke up, Jake found himself surrounded by people who wanted to know more about his technology and his knowledge of the enemy. For 20 years he had lived in anonymity, invisible to the people around him. Now he was the most important person on the planet, and everyone wanted his help. Commander Hayes approached Jake as the room was clearing out. She told him that she had always known there was something different about him, but she had never imagined anything like this. She asked if he regretted revealing himself, knowing that his quiet life was over forever. Jake looked around the room at the people who were already making plans for humanity's survival. He said that he had enjoyed his years of peace, but he had always known that someday he would have to choose between his own safety and the safety of the people he had come to care about. The choice had been easier than he had expected. As Jake prepared to leave the conference room, his bio-tattoos began glowing more brightly than they had in decades. The markings were responding to the proximity of Devourer technology and the activation of his warrior protocols. Jake was no longer a janitor hiding among humans. He was Kai Thanos of the Altarian Vanguard, and he was preparing for the war that would determine the survival of two civilizations. That night, as Jake worked with teams of scientists and engineers to begin designing Earth's new defenses, he felt something he had. The secure facility in Nevada had been built in 3 weeks, faster than anyone thought possible. Scientists and engineers from around the world worked around the clock to understand the technology that Jake was sharing with them. The bio-tattoos on his skin had become humanity's most valuable resource, containing thousands of years of advanced military knowledge. Jake stood in the main laboratory, surrounded by holographic displays that showed weapon designs and tactical information. Dr. Cooper worked beside him, helping to translate concepts that had no equivalent in human language. The work was exhausting, but Jake could see that Earth's people were learning faster than he had thought possible. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez was one of the first humans to undergo training with Altarian combat techniques. She was a Marine who had volunteered for the experimental program after hearing about the approaching invasion. Amy was tough, smart, and had the kind of stubborn determination that Jake was beginning to recognize as uniquely human. As Jake worked with Amy and other soldiers, he began to understand something that surprised him. Humans fought differently than any other species he had encountered. Most civilizations in the galaxy approached warfare as a logical problem to be solved with superior technology and tactics. But humans approached war as a personal challenge that required creativity, adaptation, and sheer willpower. Jake showed Amy footage of how other species had fought against the Devourers. She watched the battles with growing frustration, pointing out tactical errors and missed opportunities that seemed obvious to her, but had not occurred to the alien commanders. Amy's questions forced Jake to think about the war in ways he never had before. The difference became clear when Jake tried to teach Amy a standard Altarian combat formation. The formation was designed to maximize firepower while minimizing casualties, and it had been used successfully for thousands of years. But Amy kept modifying the formation, making changes that broke the rules but somehow made the tactic more effective. When Jake asked why she was changing proven techniques, Amy explained that the original formation assumed the enemy would behave in predictable ways. But real enemies, especially humans, would adapt and find weaknesses in any rigid system. Amy's modifications made the formation more flexible and harder to counter. Jake realized that this was what made humans different. Other species tried to perfect their military techniques and then use those techniques repeatedly, but humans assumed that their enemies would learn and adapt, so they built unpredictability into their own tactics. They planned for chaos instead of trying to prevent it. Sergeant Pete Collins was working with Jake on weapon development when he made another observation that changed how Jake thought about the war. Pete pointed out that the Devourers had always fought against civilizations that were either less advanced or roughly equal to themselves. They had never faced an enemy that was technologically inferior, but had access to advanced knowledge. Pete's insight led to a breakthrough in weapon design. Instead of trying to build weapons that matched Devourer technology, the human engineers began designing weapons that combined advanced Altarian concepts with simple Earth manufacturing techniques. The result was equipment that was crude but effective, and most importantly, could be built quickly and in large quantities. Jake was amazed by how fast humans could adapt new ideas to their existing capabilities. Dr. Cooper and his team had figured out how to use Jake's bio-tattoos to interface with human computer systems, creating hybrid technologies that neither species could have developed alone. The computers could process information faster than human minds, but human creativity could find solutions that pure logic missed. Commander Hayes had been promoted to lead the entire defense project. She spent her days coordinating with military leaders around the world, sharing Jake's knowledge and preparing humanity for a war unlike anything they had ever faced. Hayes had a gift for taking complex technical information and turning it into practical battle plans. As the weeks passed, Jake found himself learning as much from humans as he was teaching them. He watched Amy train new recruits in combat techniques that combined Altarian precision with human improvisation. He saw Pete and his team solve engineering problems that had taken Altarian scientists decades to master. He observed Dr. Cooper developing translation protocols that allowed instant communication between human technology and Jake's biosystems. But the most important lesson came when Jake shared the complete history of the Devourer War with Earth's military leaders. He showed them recordings of dozens of civilizations that had fallen to the enemy, hoping that humans could learn from the mistakes of others. Instead, the human commanders focused on something completely different. Admiral Morrison asked Jake why so many advanced civilizations had surrendered without fighting to the end. Jake explained that most species calculated the odds of victory and chose surrender when defeat seemed certain. This was considered the logical choice, since surrender at least allowed some members of the species to survive as prisoners. But Admiral Morrison pointed out that the Devourers did not actually keep prisoners. They consumed entire civilizations, leaving nothing behind. From a human perspective, surrender guaranteed extinction while fighting at least offered a chance of survival. The Admiral could not understand why any species would choose certain death over uncertain victory. Jake realized that this was the key difference between humans and other species. Most civilizations valued logic and calculation above all else. When faced with impossible odds, they made the rational choice to surrender. But humans valued something that Jake's people had lost, somewhere in their long history: the belief that impossible odds could be overcome through determination and sacrifice. This insight led Jake to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the war. He had always assumed that the Devourers were simply too powerful to be defeated by primitive species. But what if the problem was not the Devourers' strength, but the weakness of civilizations that gave up too easily? Jake began sharing different information with the human defenders. Instead of focusing on Devourer advantages, he started highlighting their weaknesses and limitations. The enemy was powerful, but they were also predictable. They relied on tactics that had worked for thousands of years, but they had never faced an enemy that refused to follow the expected patterns of behavior. Dr. Cooper made another crucial discovery when he was studying the bio-tattoos on Jake's skin. The markings were not just storage devices for information. They were also learning systems that adapted to new experiences and knowledge. Jake's 20 years on Earth had changed the tattoos in subtle ways, incorporating human concepts and strategies into the Altarian database. This meant that Jake was no longer purely Altarian in his thinking. He had become something new, a hybrid consciousness that combined the best qualities of both species. His strategic thinking had been influenced by human unpredictability, while his combat skills had been enhanced by human adaptability. The implications were enormous. If Jake could change through exposure to human thinking, then perhaps other aspects of the war could be changed as well. The Devourers expected to face opponents who thought and fought like every other species they had encountered. They were not prepared for an enemy that had learned to think in completely new ways. Jake began working with Commander Hayes to develop a defense strategy that took advantage of humanity's unique qualities. Instead of trying to match the Devourers in conventional warfare, Earth would fight an unconventional war that used surprise, adaptation, and sheer stubbornness to overcome technological disadvantages. The strategy required Jake to do something he had never done before: trust another species with the most advanced military secrets of his people. He had to believe that humans would use Altarian technology responsibly, even in the desperate circumstances of an invasion. It was a leap of faith that went against everything Jake had been taught about protecting advanced knowledge. But as Jake watched humans working together to prepare for the war, he saw something that gave him confidence in his decision. Earth's people were not just fighting for their own survival. They were fighting for the survival of an idea that any civilization, no matter how primitive, had the right to exist and grow at its own pace. Jake realized that this was what the galaxy had lost in its long history of advanced civilizations. Somewhere along the way, species had forgotten that diversity and unpredictability were strengths, not weaknesses. They had become so focused on perfection and efficiency that they had lost the ability to adapt and overcome. As the first prototype weapons came off the production lines, Jake felt something he had not experienced since the early days of the Devourer War: hope for victory instead of just hope for survival. Humans were proving that advancement was not just about technology. It was also about the willingness to fight for something bigger than yourself, even when the odds seemed impossible. The bio-tattoos on Jake's skin glowed brighter than they had in decades as they processed the flood of new information and strategies. Jake was no longer just an Altarian warrior hiding on a primitive planet. He had become the bridge between two species, and together they were going to show the galaxy that the Age of Devourer dominance was about to end. The invasion fleet was still months away, but Jake C. The first ships appeared at the edge of the solar system 3 weeks earlier than Jake had predicted. Deep space monitoring stations detected massive objects moving toward Earth at impossible speeds. Their approach coordinated with military precision that chilled everyone who saw the tracking data. Jake was in the command center when the alerts began streaming in. His bio tattoos immediately began glowing brighter as they analyzed the incoming signals. The patterns he saw confirmed his worst fears. This was not just a scouting force, but a full advance fleet designed to test Earth's defenses and soften the planet for the main invasion. Admiral Morrison stood beside Jake, watching the tactical displays that showed dozens of bioships entering the outer solar system. Each ship was the size of a city and moved with the fluid grace of a living creature. The Admiral asked Jake how long they had before the ships reached Earth. Jake studied the movement patterns for several minutes before answering. The advance fleet was not rushing toward Earth. Instead, they were taking their time, deploying smaller scout vessels and analyzing the defenses that humanity had built over the past few months. Jake estimated they had perhaps 6 hours before the real attack began. Commander Hayes activated the global defense network that had been built using Jake's knowledge and human engineering. Military bases around the world came online with weapons that combined Altarian energy systems with Earth manufacturing techniques. The weapons were crude compared to full Altarian technology, but they could fire projectiles at near light speed and generate energy beams that could cut through almost anything. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez was at a forward observation post in orbit when she got her first look at a Devourer bioship. The vessel looked like a cross between a giant insect and a warship, with organic curves that pulsed with internal light. Amy had trained with Jake for months, but seeing the enemy in person was different from studying tactical displays. Amy reported that the bioship was scanning Earth's orbital defenses with energy beams that felt warm against her skin, even through the shielding of her observation station. The ship was learning about human technology, analyzing weaknesses and preparing countermeasures. Amy realized that every second of delay was giving the enemy more information about how to defeat Earth's defenses. Jake made a decision that surprised everyone in the command center. Instead of waiting for the Devourers to attack, he recommended that Earth strike first. The conventional military wisdom was to let the enemy commit to an attack and then respond, but Jake argued that human unpredictability was their greatest weapon. The Devourers would not expect primitive defenders to launch the first strike. Admiral Morrison authorized the attack, and Earth's new weapons fired their first shots in anger. Energy beams and high-velocity projectiles reached across space to strike the advance fleet. The human weapons were not as sophisticated as what the Devourers expected to face, but they were more powerful than anything that should have been possible for a primitive civilization. The first bioship that was hit reeled back as if it had been physically slapped. Its organic hull rippled and sparked as internal systems tried to compensate for damage they had not been designed to handle. The ship's crew had expected to face primitive projectile weapons and chemical explosives, not coherent energy beams that could punch through their defensive screens. But the Devourers adapted quickly. The advance fleet changed formation and began deploying countermeasures designed to stop energy weapons. Their return fire was precise and devastating, destroying 3 orbital defense stations in the first exchange. Jake watched the tactical display and realized that Earth's technological advantage would not last long against an enemy that had been fighting wars for thousands of years. Sergeant Pete Collins was commanding a ground-based weapon system when the first Devourer landing craft reached Earth's atmosphere. The craft were smaller versions of the main bioships, but they moved with frightening speed and agility. Pete's weapons tracked the incoming craft and fired everything they had, but the enemy ships absorbed the damage and kept coming. The landing craft touched down in major population centers around the world. Instead of disgorging troops like human ships would have done, the craft began growing. They spread across the landscape like living cancer, consuming everything they touched and converting the material into more bioship tissue. Within minutes, the landing sites had become expanding zones of alien growth that threatened to consume entire cities. Jake's bio-tattoos began displaying information that he had hoped never to see again. The markings showed him tactical data about Devourer ground operations, including the deployment patterns that the enemy was using on Earth. Jake realized that the Devourers were not just trying to defeat humanity militarily, they were trying to consume the planet itself, turning Earth into raw material for their fleet. Commander Hayes coordinated the global response to the landing sites. Military units equipped with hybrid human-Altarian weapons moved to contain the spreading bioship growth, but the enemy adapted to each new attack. When humans used energy weapons, the bioships developed energy-absorbing tissues. When humans used projectile weapons, the bioships grew armor that could deflect solid objects. Dr. Cooper was monitoring the enemy communications when he made a disturbing discovery. The Devourer ships were not just communicating with each other, they were also trying to communicate with Jake's bio-tattoos, sending signals that attempted to override his Altarian technology and turn him into a tool of the invasion. Jake felt the attempted intrusion like ice water in his veins. The Devourers were trying to access the Altarian database stored in his tattoos, hoping to learn about Earth's defenses from the inside. But Jake's 20 years among humans had changed him in ways the Devourers did not understand. His biotechnology had been influenced by human creativity and stubbornness, making it resistant to the enemy's control signals. Instead of being taken over by the Devourer signals, Jake found that he could use his bio-tattoos to interfere with enemy communications. He began broadcasting counter-signals that disrupted Devourer coordination and caused confusion in their attack patterns. For the first time in the invasion, the enemy force began making tactical errors. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez led a strike team against one of the landing sites. Her team used weapons and tactics that Jake had taught them, but Amy added her own modifications based on human military experience. Instead of attacking the bioship growth directly, Amy's team targeted the underlying systems that controlled the growth, causing sections of the alien tissue to collapse on themselves. The Devourer response was swift and brutal. Enemy bioships in orbit began bombarding the areas where human resistance was strongest, using weapons that turned matter into energy and left nothing but empty craters behind. But the human defenders had learned from Jake's knowledge of Devourer tactics. They had dispersed their forces and built underground facilities that could survive even orbital bombardment. Sergeant Pete Collins discovered something important during one of the ground battles. When human weapons were fired in combination with signals from Jake's bio-tattoos, they became more effective against Devourer defenses. The hybrid technology was creating a resonance effect that the enemy could not easily counter. Jake realized that this was the key to Earth's survival. Humans could not match the Devourers in pure technology, but they could use the combination of human adaptability and Altarian knowledge to create weapons and tactics that the enemy had never encountered before. The bio-tattoos on Jake's skin were not just information storage devices. They were the interface that allowed two completely different approaches to warfare to work together. As the first day of the invasion continued, a pattern began to emerge. The Devourers would deploy a new tactic or weapon, and the humans would quickly adapt to counter it. But instead of just defending, the human forces would then modify their own tactics to exploit weaknesses they had discovered in the enemy response. This created a cycle of rapid adaptation that kept the Devourers constantly off balance. Admiral Morrison watched the battle reports from around the world and saw something that gave him hope. Humanity was not just surviving the first Devourer attack. In some areas, human forces were actually pushing the enemy back. The bioship growth had been stopped in several cities, and 3 of the landing craft had been completely destroyed. But Jake warned that this was only the beginning. The advance fleet was just testing Earth's defenses and learning about human capabilities. The real invasion would come later, when the Devourers had developed specific countermeasures for everything they had seen today. Earth had won the first battle, but the war was far from over. As night fell on the first day of the invasion, Jake stood in the command center and watched the tactical displays that showed the status of the global battle. His bio-tattoos were glowing so brightly that they illuminated the entire room. The markings had evolved throughout the day, incorporating new tactical data and adapting to the hybrid technologies that humans had developed. Jake realized that he was no longer the same being who had crashed on Earth 20 years ago. His exposure to human thinking had changed him on a fundamental level. And now, 3 months after the first Devourer attack, Earth had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a fortress world that was actively fighting back and winning. The news of humanity's resistance had spread across the galaxy through communication networks that the Devourers thought they controlled, reaching scattered survivors of dozens of extinct civilizations. Captain Nina Foster was commanding the Orbital Defense Station when the first refugee ship appeared at the edge of the solar system. The vessel was unlike anything in the Devourer fleet, but it was also clearly not human. Nina's sensors showed that the ship was badly damaged and barely functional, limping toward Earth on failing engines. Jake was brought to the command center to analyze the approaching vessel. His bio-tattoos began displaying information as soon as he saw the sensor readings. The ship was Altarian, one of the few vessels that had survived the destruction of his homeworld. Jake felt emotions he had not experienced in 20 years as he realized that some of his people were still alive. The refugee ship requested permission to approach Earth, transmitting identification codes that Jake recognized from his youth. The ship carried 200 Altarian survivors who had been hiding in deep space for years, afraid to settle anywhere because they knew the Devourers would eventually find them. But when they heard about Earth's resistance, they had decided to risk everything to join the fight. Admiral Morrison authorized the ship to land, but he also ordered full security precautions. Earth's leaders had learned to be careful about who they trusted, even potential allies. Jake accompanied the landing party that met the refugee ship, serving as both translator and security advisor. The Altarian refugees were led by Commander Zara Thane, a warrior who had served with Jake in the Vanguard before the war scattered their people across the galaxy. Zara was amazed to see that Jake had survived, but she was even more amazed to learn what he had accomplished on Earth. She had never imagined that a primitive species could be taught to fight the Devourers successfully, but Zara brought disturbing news from other parts of the galaxy. The Devourers had not been idle since their failed attack on Earth. They had consumed 3 more star systems and added the resources to their fleet. Worse, they had been studying the reports from Earth and developing new weapons specifically designed to counter human tactics. Jake learned that other refugee groups had been drawn to Earth by news of the resistance. Ships carrying survivors from the Kellian Republic, the Throne Worlds, and the Synthetic Collective were all making their way toward human space. Each group brought knowledge of different technologies and fighting techniques that had failed against the Devourers in the past. Dr. Cooper found himself coordinating the most unusual diplomatic mission in human history. Representatives from a dozen different species were gathering on Earth, all united by their determination to stop the Devourers from consuming the galaxy. Cooper's experience with alien languages made him the perfect person to facilitate communication between groups that had never worked together before. The arriving refugees were amazed by what they found on Earth. Humans had not just survived a Devourer attack. They had driven the enemy back and captured several bioships for study. More importantly, humans had developed new technologies by combining their own engineering with knowledge. From Jake's bio-tattoos, Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez was assigned to train refugee volunteers in the combat techniques that humans had developed. Amy found that each species brought unique abilities to the training program. The Kellians had natural telepathic abilities that made them excellent coordinators. The synthetics could interface directly with computer systems. The former citizens of the Throne Worlds had experience with energy weapons that exceeded even Altarian technology. But Amy also discovered that most of the refugee species had a hard time adapting to human military philosophy. They were used to following rigid battle plans and established procedures. The idea of improvising tactics in the middle of a fight was foreign to them. Amy had to teach them that being unpredictable was more important than being perfect. Jake worked with Commander Zara and the other Altarian survivors to integrate their knowledge with the human defense systems. The refugees brought technical information that filled gaps in Jake's bio-tattoo database, particularly regarding the latest Devourer weapons and tactics. But Jake found that his 20 years among humans had given him insights that even his fellow Altarians could not understand. Zara was particularly interested in the changes she could see in Jake's bio-tattoos. The markings had evolved far beyond their original programming, incorporating human concepts that had no equivalent in Altarian thinking. Zara realized that Jake had become something new, a hybrid consciousness that could think in ways that neither species had achieved alone. The integration of refugee populations created new challenges for Earth's leaders. Captain Foster was put in charge of managing the orbital facilities that housed thousands of beings from different worlds. She had to deal with species that had different environmental needs, different social structures, and different ideas about how to fight the war. Some of the refugees wanted to leave Earth and continue running from the devourers. They argued that gathering so many survivors in one place would only make it easier for the enemy to find and destroy them. But others believed that Earth represented the galaxy's last hope for stopping the devourers once and for all. Jake found himself in the middle of these debates, serving as a bridge between human determination and alien caution. He understood the fear that drove some refugees to want to keep running, but he also believed that humans had shown a way to win that no one had tried before. The key was not to avoid the devourers, but to face them with tactics they could not predict or counter. Dr. Cooper made a breakthrough when he was studying communication intercepts from the refugee ships. He discovered that the devourers had been tracking the refugees by monitoring their traditional communication methods. But the hybrid human-Altarian communication systems that Earth had developed were invisible to devourer sensors. This led to the creation of a new galactic communication network that allowed scattered resistance groups to coordinate their activities without being detected. For the first time since the war began, the survivors of extinct civilizations could work together instead of hiding in isolation. Sergeant Pete Collins was working with synthetic engineers when they developed a new type of weapon that combined human manufacturing techniques with synthetic energy manipulation and Altarian targeting systems. The weapon was more powerful than anything any single species had created, but more importantly, it could be modified rapidly to counter new devourer defenses. As more refugee groups arrived, Earth began to transform into something unprecedented, a multicultural fortress world where different species worked together to develop new ways of fighting an ancient enemy. The diversity that the devourers had always seen as weakness became a source of strength as each species contributed unique capabilities to the common defense. Jake's bio-tattoos continued to evolve as they processed information from all the different species working on Earth. The markings began displaying tactical concepts that had never existed before, strategies that required the combined abilities of multiple species to implement. Jake realized that the war was not just changing him personally, but was creating new possibilities for all the species involved. Commander Hayes coordinated the defense preparations as intelligence reports indicated that the main Devourer fleet was approaching. The enemy force was larger than anything they had faced before, but Earth was no longer defending alone. The planet had become the center of a galactic alliance that combined the knowledge and abilities of dozens of different civilizations. The refugees brought with them cultural concepts that changed how humans thought about the war. The Kellians introduced the idea of fighting for the memory of extinct worlds. The synthetics emphasized the importance of preserving knowledge for future generations. The former citizens of the Throne Worlds insisted that the war was about the right of all species to exist and grow at their own pace. Jake found that these new perspectives changed his own understanding of what they were fighting for. This was not just about stopping the devourers or protecting Earth. This was about proving that diversity and cooperation were stronger than conquest and consumption. The galaxy had forgotten this lesson, but humanity was teaching it again. As the final preparations were made for the coming battle, Jake stood in the main command center surrounded by beings from worlds that had been destroyed decades ago. His bio-tattoos glowed with information from a dozen different species, creating patterns that had never existed before in galactic history. Jake realized that he was no longer just an Altarian warrior or even a human-influenced hybrid. He had become something entirely new, the living symbol of what could be achieved when different species worked together instead of competing against each other. The Devourers had spent thousands of years consuming civilizations one at a time, but now they would face an enemy that combined the best qualities of every species they had thought they had destroyed. The main invasion fleet was only days away, but Jake felt more confident than he had since. The war began. The galaxy's survivors had found each other. They had learned. The main Devourer fleet arrived like a dark cloud that blotted out the stars. 300 bioships emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the solar system, each one larger than the largest human city. They moved in perfect formation, their organic hulls pulsing with malevolent life as they began their approach toward Earth. Jake stood in the primary command center, his bio-tattoos blazing with light as they processed tactical information from across the solar system. Around him, beings from a dozen different species worked together to coordinate humanity's final defense. The markings on Jake's skin had evolved throughout the war, and now they displayed patterns that had never existed before in galactic history. Admiral Morrison watched the tactical displays that showed the approaching enemy fleet. Earth's defenses had grown far beyond what anyone had thought possible 6 months ago. Orbital battle stations bristled with hybrid weapons that combined human engineering with alien knowledge. Ground-based installations could fire projectiles at near light speed. Fleets of small, fast ships waited in the asteroid belt to harass the enemy flanks. But everyone in the command center knew that conventional defenses would not be enough against such a massive force. The Devourers had brought enough firepower to crack planets, and they had specifically designed their weapons to counter everything they had learned about human tactics during the first invasion. Commander Zarathane coordinated the Altarian refugee forces from a station beside Jake. She had been amazed by the changes in her old comrade over the past months. Jake's bio-tattoos now incorporated tactical concepts from every species in the Alliance, creating strategic possibilities that no single civilization had ever imagined. Captain Nina Foster commanded the orbital defenses as the enemy fleet spread out across the solar system. The Devourers were not rushing toward Earth as they had during previous invasions. Instead, they were taking their time, deploying scout ships and analyzing the defenses that the Alliance had built. Nina realized that the enemy was being more careful because they had learned to respect human unpredictability. The first shots of the final battle were fired by Earth's outer defense stations as the Devourer scout ships came within range. Energy beams and projectile weapons reached across millions of miles to strike the enemy vessels. The scouts were destroyed, but not before they had transmitted detailed information about human capabilities to the main fleet. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez led a strike force of volunteers from multiple species as they launched a surprise attack on the enemy formation. Her ships were small and fast, designed to exploit the one advantage the Alliance had over the Devourers: the ability to adapt tactics in real time. Amy's force hit the enemy fleet and then scattered before the Devourers could respond effectively. But the main Devourer force was too large to be stopped by hit-and-run tactics. The bioships continued their advance, absorbing the damage from Alliance weapons and adapting their defenses with each attack. Jake watched the tactical displays and realized that conventional warfare would not save Earth. They needed something that the Devourers had never encountered before. Jake made a decision that surprised everyone in the command center. He announced that he was going to use his bio-tattoos to interface directly with Earth's entire defense network. This would allow him to coordinate all Alliance forces in real time, but it would also put enormous strain on his nervous system. Dr. Cooper warned that the process might kill him, but Jake said it was the only way to give Earth a chance. The bio-tattoos on Jake's skin began spreading as he connected to the global network. The markings flowed down his arms and across his chest, linking him to weapon systems, communication networks, and sensor arrays around the world. Jake became a living interface between the Alliance forces and their technology, processing information faster than any computer and making tactical decisions at the speed of thought. Sergeant Pete Collins commanded ground-based weapons as the Devourer fleet entered Earth's atmosphere. The enemy bioships were so large that they blocked out the sun as they descended toward major population centers. Pete's weapons fired everything they had, but the enemy ships absorbed the damage and continued their approach. But Jake was coordinating the defense in ways that the Devourers could not understand. Instead of fighting each ship individually, the Alliance forces were working together as a single organism. When one weapon system was destroyed, others immediately adapted to fill the gap. When the enemy developed a new countermeasure, the Alliance forces shifted to different tactics before the Devourers could deploy their solution widely. Dr. Cooper monitored Jake's vital signs as the strain of controlling the global defense network began taking its toll. Jake's bio-tattoos were now covering his entire body, pulsing with energy that was visible even in bright sunlight. Cooper realized that Jake was undergoing a transformation that was changing him on a fundamental level. The turning point came when Commander Zara led a desperate assault on the largest Devourer bioship. Her force was outnumbered 100 to 1, but Jake was able to coordinate their attack with precision that bordered on precognition. Every shot hit exactly where it would do the most damage, and every maneuver avoided enemy fire by microseconds. As the battle raged across Earth's sky, something unprecedented began to happen. The biotattoos on Jake's skin started to spread beyond his body, creating patterns of light that extended into the air around him. The markings were no longer just biological technology. They had become something new, a bridge between organic and digital systems that allowed perfect coordination between beings and machines. Captain Foster watched from her orbital station as the tide of battle began to turn. The Devourer fleet was still enormous, but they were no longer fighting separate groups of defenders. They were facing a single unified force that could adapt faster than they could respond. For the first time in the war, the Devourers were being outmaneuvered by their intended victims. The enemy fleet tried to fall back and regroup, but Jake anticipated their movements and positioned Alliance forces to cut off their retreat. The biotattoos had given him access to tactical information that spanned the entire solar system, allowing him to see patterns that no individual mind could have processed. Lieutenant Amy's strike force scored a crucial victory when they destroyed the command bioship that was coordinating the enemy fleet. The ship's destruction caused chaos in the Devourer formation, as individual vessels lost contact with their central command. Jake immediately ordered all Alliance forces to press their advantage, hitting the confused enemy ships before they could reorganize. As the battle continued, Jake felt his consciousness expanding beyond his physical body. The biotattoos had connected him not just to Earth's technology, but to the minds of every person fighting in the defense of the planet. He could feel the determination of human soldiers, the ancient courage of Altarian warriors, and the desperate hope of refugees who had lost everything but refused to surrender. The Devourer fleet began to retreat as they realized they were facing something they had never encountered before. In thousands of years of conquest, they had always fought against civilizations that followed predictable patterns. But Earth's defenders were not just unpredictable. They were actively learning and adapting faster than the Devourers could counter. Sergeant Pete's ground forces scored a major victory when they captured a damaged bioship that had crashed near his position. Using techniques that Jake was transmitting through the global network, Pete's team was able to turn the ship's own weapons against the rest of the Devourer fleet. The sight of a bioship firing on its own kind sent shockwaves through the enemy formation. Dr. Cooper watched in amazement as Jake's transformation continued. The biotattoos had spread beyond Jake's body and were now visible as patterns of light that filled the entire command center. Jake had become something that transcended individual consciousness, a living network that connected every defender on Earth. Commander Zara realized that Jake was no longer the warrior she had known in their youth. He had become something entirely new, a bridge between species that allowed perfect cooperation in ways that no single civilization had ever achieved. The war had changed him from an individual fighter into a symbol of what the galaxy could become if its people worked together. The final phase of the battle began when the remaining Devourer ships tried to escape the solar system, but Jake had anticipated their retreat and positioned Alliance forces to block every possible escape route. The enemy fleet found itself trapped, surrounded by defenders who had learned to fight with coordination that seemed almost supernatural. Captain Foster led the final assault on the Devourer flagship, a massive bioship that dwarfed everything else in the enemy fleet. The ship was protected by defenses that should have been impenetrable, but Jake was able to identify weak points and coordinate the attack with precision that made victory possible. As the flagship began to break apart under the Alliance assault, something unexpected happened. The ship transmitted a signal that Jake's biotattoos translated as a request for communication. For the first time in the war, the Devourers wanted to talk instead of fight. The message was simple but profound. The Devourer,